It's a double price shock for Africans. Across the continent, fuel and fertilizer costs have shot up. The higher cost of fuel is immediately obvious. Anyone who needs to fill up a tank saw the price skyrocket after the US-Israeli attacks on Iran began. But the immediate problem may not be the worst one. That could still be to come. Fertilizer costs are directly linked to energy costs. That's brought a windfall for Nigeria's Dangote refinery, which is Africa's largest. It has increased exports of the nitrogen fertilizer urea to African countries hit by supply disruptions caused by the conflict. Dangote has the capacity to produce up to 3 million metric tons of the nitrogen fertilizer annually, which usually goes to the United States and South America. Aliko Dangote pledged to African nations that that capacity could be used to supply them.
The challenges are many. One is of urea, which is fertilizer that we have. I think in the last couple of days we've been loading to mostly African countries, which we are not doing before. And then now is to do with also petroleum products, which are now sending mainly to African countries.
Right, so urea contains nitrogen, rocket fuel for crop plants. No nitrogen, then no food grows. And nitrogen is just one of the many essential inputs into agriculture products, many of them imported to Africa from Gulf countries. The Food and Agriculture Organization already warning about the maths of the global commodities trade through the Strait of Hormuz, closed off by the war. It carries up to 35% of oil, 20 to 25% of natural gas, 30% of fertilizer, and 45% of sulfur, which is used to make phosphate, another nutrient for crop plants. From farmers to shoppers, many say the price shock is already being felt and could soon hit household budgets even harder. South African consumers are bracing for higher food prices after fuel costs jumped during the conflict. Most food and goods in the country are transported by road. And at the start of the month, diesel prices surged by 40%, while petrol rose by 15%. Now, whenever the fighting ends, many households fear the economic impact could last much longer. DW's Diane Hawker-Kalubi has more on this.
Petunia Lemokwana is finding herself doing difficult calculations for her weekly shop. Whichever way she looks at it, it doesn't add up. What can she afford to buy for her family? And what does she have to leave behind?
I think we're coping just by the grace of God. It's hard. The pinch is felt by everyone, everywhere. We're also feeling it.
She's one of millions of South Africans nervously looking at both their wallets and events unfolding in Iran. The conflict pushed up petrol and diesel prices, making the transport of goods more expensive. This fellow shopper says the latest price increase has her on edge.
I feel the price increase is hectically a very heavy knock, because me speaking as a pensioner, it's very hard. I go into a shop and I take necessary stuff. I do away with luxuries. I do away with a lot of stuff.
The owners and workers of this family-owned store are worried. Firstly, with the price of fuel already increasing, they're anticipating that it will become more expensive to get products like these onto their shelves. Secondly, they're concerned that in some cases, farmers might choose not to plant certain crops because of the cost of fuel. And this in turn will lead to increases in prices that they'll have to pass on to customers. Terry Falk has been working with produce for over 40 years, first as a farmer and later in distribution. He says the increased costs can break a farmer's profit margin.
Diesel affects everything. You know, the farmers need fertilizer, it's going to affect the price of fertilizer. They need seed, they need packaging. You know, the increase in diesel is going to affect all that stuff, that input cost, it's all going to go up. So it's not just putting diesel in your tank and driving, it's everything else.
And many South African farmers are either preparing to harvest summer crops, which requires a lot of fuel, or plant winter crops, which require a lot of fertilizer. South Africa imports 80% of its fertilizer, and 33% of global nitrogen supplies originate in the Middle East.
We'll start to worry more about the fertilizer prices from June onwards, because the next season, which is critical, starts from October 2026. And that's the reality of South Africa, but also that's the reality of the greater part of the continent, because much of the countries in the sub-Saharan Africa region, they receive some of the fertilizer from South Africa. So availability of it here has implications from the region.
While larger farms and businesses may be able to absorb the immediate shocks, smaller businesses and households could struggle.
It's unfortunate, but in every price increase, that's where it ends up. The consumer has to pay more, and that's the bottom line.
And in a country with over 30% unemployment and poverty levels as high as in South Africa, small changes in the cost of living can have a big impact.
Right. The ceasefire is already looking shaky. And even if it holds, will it bring an end to the energy and fertilizer crisis facing African countries? I asked Murithi Mutiga, Program Director for Africa at the International Crisis Group.
The long-run effects will be very substantial. We know that 15% of Africa's imports come from the Middle East. 10% of exports are sent there. There's been already a huge inflationary impact from the conflict, and from all the analysis we've seen is that unwinding the supply chain shocks and the supply chain disruptions, getting all those refineries, storage facilities, oil and gas fields back online, apparently nearly 10% of the world's oil supply, will also take time. So this is good news, but we really will have to experience a couple of months of fairly difficult economic times.
Oh, couple of months. That sounds tough for the many African countries and the people that are suffering from this. But I do remember the International Crisis Group earlier calling for a, quote, Hormuz initiative to protect global food security. That was similar to the 2022 Black Sea grain deal. What would that really look like, and what does the ceasefire plan mean for that?
Yes, right. So the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was heavily negotiated by Turkey and the United Nations, was really important because the result of it is that we saw nearly 33 million tons of Ukrainian grain come into the market. That led to a lowering of prices. And as you know, in Africa, many families, one of the biggest items for their budget is household food. And so that was really important. The way that we've framed this as the International Crisis Group is to suggest that whatever happens with the war, there should be at least a corridor that allows especially fertilizer and food through this very important choke point. Every war tends to give us a new lesson in geography. Many of us didn't know that a lot of fertilizer comes through, for example, from the Gulf. And that has been a real shock. We know that many African countries are approaching the planting season. So whatever happens with the war, I think it would be really helpful if at least those essential items were allowed through.
Right. Talking about countries approaching the planting season, we're hearing concerns about fertilizer shortages. I'm just wondering how that could affect farmers and food security across Africa in the coming months.
So this is a continent where nearly 7 in 10 people depend on subsistence agriculture. I think it's really important. It also underpins a lot of economies, both from a food consumption perspective, but also from an exports perspective in terms of the export income. I think another very important thing to point out is that when you don't really have enough supply of fertilizer, it tends to send prices up. So this just doesn't affect Africa. We already see Brazilian farmers, American farmers anxious about the planting season. So it will be really critical to address the fertilizer supply issue. The only thing I would mention from a positive perspective is that we are now seeing a real discussion about resilient supply chains, a big discussion about relying more on countries like Morocco, Nigeria, Egypt. We already see the Nigerian investor Aliko Dangote considering building a fertilizer factory in Ethiopia. So that's positive, but in the short run, unfortunately, it seems there'll be quite a high price to pay.
All right, you touch on some things that I may throw a bit more questions to you on that. But I do remember the global response to the oil crisis, I should say, at the start of the war, the release of strategic reserves. Is there anything similar that could be done with fertilizers?
So that's a really important question. And I'll just mention a couple of things. One is that, the thing is that economies in this part of the world are not as resilient as elsewhere. We don't really have the same stock even of fuel reserves in many countries. We've seen several countries say that they have stocks maybe ranging between 16 days to 30 days. We already saw cutbacks in operating hours in Egypt. So there's a real vulnerability, but there is much more anxiety about fertilizer because we don't really have excess supply. I think we've learned as a world to depend on just-in-time supplies rather than, building up stock over time. So that really is very worrying. But we wonder whether there could be an inventory. Maybe people like the United Nations could look around the world and see which countries might have excess stock and whether they might be willing to share them. But for now, we don't really have as much hope that there could be enough supply of fertilizer, especially in the short run.
Right. Short term, you say that will still be a challenge. Now, look, when things like this happen, it really begs this question, or the fact that Africa has major oil and gas producers. So it just makes one wonder why the continent still is so vulnerable to global energy shocks like this.
I think a big failure of African leaders over time has been the reliance on crude rather than trying to refine it. I've always found it quite extraordinary that major oil producers also still have huge queues for fuel because they depend so much on imports. I think one of the positive things we've seen in recent years is that, for example, the Dangote refinery has finally brought Nigeria where it belongs in the ranks of countries that refine the product. It will take time, but we also see some shoots of hope. We know that there's this major liquefied natural gas plant in Mozambique. There's been an uptick in interest, but also an interest in having joint regional investment in things like that. We also see countries like Kenya, South Africa expressing an interest in importing refined fuel products from Nigeria. So that's important. But you ask a really important question. It's a big failure of African elites for so many years that there's been such reliance on imports.
Right. Also, you mentioned Kenya. East Africa generally is expanding renewable energy. Kenya, for example, is a global leader in green electricity. So why is there still such heavy reliance on imported oil from the Middle East? What is it being used for?
So a couple of things. One is that, yes, it's really notable. Kenya, it's quite remarkable, nearly 96% of energy coming from clean fuel sources. Geothermal has been very important. Hydroelectric has been extremely critical. But where there has been a big lag is the effort to move towards green technology and especially electric vehicles. So in terms of transportation, there's still a huge reliance on imported oil, particularly for trucking. But now, again, maybe slightly looking on the positive side, there's a huge debate and a huge discussion that the policy needs to be updated and especially if you can imagine removing tax on electric vehicles. Normally, as you know, in many countries in this part of the world, there are very high taxes on imported vehicles. And so if you can move in that direction, it will be helpful. But the second thing, expanding railways, I think that would be really critical. And then the third thing generally is, just bringing in those incentives. There's been discussion about setting up electric vehicle manufacturers, or at least even assemblers within the region, which would make them more affordable. Ethiopia is doing better than the rest of the region in that respect, but I hope this will be a wake-up call.
Right. I mean, as you say, a lot more is needed for the continent to reduce its dependence on the Middle East, because it's, as you say, Africa has oil, gas, renewables, and critical minerals. These are the building blocks for energy autonomy. How realistic is that in the near future?
Again, that's really important. I would say that there's been a degree of complacency. I think a degree that life will go on as usual. But what I would mention is that we have to remember that the 1973 oil shock, when Gulf countries stopped exporting oil, it had a profound effect on the continent. It even, I would argue, led to the first wave of the collapse of a lot of these autocracies that had been in power for quite a long time, because there was such a big inflationary effect. And then when it was compounded with the end of the Cold War, it had a really profound impact. So I hope this will be a wake-up call. But as you suggest, really, there is no excuse. There's no reason why Africa should be so dependent on others. Can I just mention also critical minerals? It's another issue we are waking up to. So much is being exported in raw form, while in fact this is the driving fuel of the economy of the future. And so I think that there really needs to be a discussion about improvement, about processing, and about doing more on the continent rather than exporting crude.
Right. Look, this is something I'm very passionate about. I could go on and on, but due to time, we'll leave it here. Muruti Mutiga, Program Director for Africa with International Crisis Group. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Another reason many Kenyans depend on imported fuels is cooking. Bottled gas is seen as cleaner and safer than common alternatives like kerosene, wood, or charcoal. But with prices rising, the cleaner and safer option is becoming a luxury. DW's Edith Kimani sent us this update from a kitchen in Nairobi.
Christine Mudeu cooks with kerosene, but not because she wants to. When heated, kerosene emits toxic fumes, and Christine knows this. The empty gas cylinder in her kitchen tells a story of better days. Right now, kerosene is what she can afford.
At the end of the day, it costs me about €1.30 for kerosene, and I can only afford to buy small quantities worth 30 cents because I usually don't have the money.
When conflict flared in the Middle East, global fuel prices surged, including kerosene. In March, the Kenyan government stepped in, absorbing the cost before it reached the pump. Prices have steadied since the ceasefire in Iran was announced, but the crisis has exposed a bigger structural problem in the country.
Kenya imports every drop of fuel it uses. The country has no strategic oil reserves, only a 21-day stock required by industry regulators. And that leaves the country exposed to price and supply shocks every time a shipping route is closed.
This vulnerability runs deeper. All of the oil used in Kenya comes from the Middle East under long-term agreements with Gulf suppliers. Energy expert Ogutu Okudo says that single-source dependency is the core issue.
If you're trying to go to destination A, it's important to have two different routes that go there. What has happened in the geopolitics in the Middle East has changed everything for a very long time. I don't see things going back to the norm, and that means we're going to have to pivot and we're going to have to look at the next best option.
Kenya's own offshore resources may hold part of the answer. The country launched oil exploration years ago, but halted it before meaningful investment took hold. Okudo says that while the geology is promising, exploration needs funding.
To make an investment attractive, you need to invest in that investment. If you decided to go and sell a piece of land outside there right now, You would get more if you decided to fence the land, if you did a study on its soil, if you built a road. And that's equivalent in Kenya is we need to invest in more seismic studies.
Okudos are long-term solutions, while Christine Mudeu is living in the short term, waiting to see whether the next disruption will be one she can survive.
We have children and we have to cook for them. That means even if the costs go up, we will just continue to make pleas for it to be lowered. But we still have to buy it.